My name is Ryley, and you are listening to the Ryley Heppner podcast. So right off the bat, I mean, Revelation has clearly been such a topic of your writing and publishing. I'd be interested to know what first sparked your interest in the book of Revelation. Was there a particular experience or question that led to you focusing so intensely through your career on that?
Um, well, it came about in a very natural way. When I wanted to do my doctorate, I had done a lot of work at the seminary level. I did a THM, and and I'd done some work in the old and the new. So when I began to think about studies and got accepted to a few schools in United Kingdom, I talked to my professor who taught me Old and the New at seminary. I said, what area needs research on the use of the Old and the New Testament? What's been least written on? And he said the book of Revelation. Well, when he said that, my heart sunk because I knew nothing about the book of Revelation. I hadn't studied it much in seminary. I almost veered away from it because of, the school I was at was Dallas Theological Seminary, and they were very
Okay.
dispensational, and I wasn't. And so, anyway, but I trusted him. So I did my dissertation on the use of Daniel in Jewish apocalyptic literature and in the book of Revelation. So that's what I did. I did that. I published that, and then was asked to, somewhere around 1987, roughly about 7 years after I'd graduated, I was asked by I. Howard Marshall if I wanted to contribute to, this series and write on Revelation. So actually, he asked me at the beginning if he wanted me to do Second Peter and Jude. And that was fine. I accepted that. Well, then a fellow by the name of Colin Brown, who had been slated to do Revelation in the New International Greek Testament Commentary series, which is the series I had been asked to contribute in. Um, he said, "Well, the guy writing Revelations dropped out. Would you like to do Revelation?" And that was kind of a hard decision because it's like how many more chapters? I mean, Second Peter
Sure.
and Jude is 4 chapters, and wow, all of a sudden we're talking about 18 more chapters. And so I talked to my wife about it. She said, "Well, that's a no-brainer. What have you done your doctoral work on? You definitely should do Revelation." So that took me 8 years, and it took the publisher 3 years to publish it. So
Oh, okay.
quite a long project.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the story there. I didn't really have any innate interest in the book of Revelation,
Oh, that's very
but,
interesting. And now you've just
but
kind of become such a person in that field. Now you probably more projects just get sent your way too
yeah,
with Revelation.
interest in it grew. So I've written, now trying to think, probably four books on the book of
Okay.
Revelation.
Okay. I imagine
You
this
know,
is a.
it
Oh,
doesn't
sorry. Go
look
ahead.
like I'm looking at you because I have a big monitor and your face is on the monitor, but
Okay.
my camera is here. Does that
Sure.
bother you?
No, no, not at all. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of people will be listening to this probably then versus
Okay.
watching anyway. So
Okay. Good.
be a
Good.
problem. I imagine this is I don't know, almost rhetorical, but have there been initial questions, perspectives about Revelation that have changed for you as you've studied it more deeply?
Oh, let me see. Well, when I started studying it, I got a good overview of it from a popular book, and it was by an author called William Hendrickson, and
Okay.
it's called More Than Conquerors. In fact, my wife and I read it together in the evenings through it, and so it's a little more popular, but I still highly recommend it to my students. It gives an overview of the Book of Revelation, and so. And then I uh, was exposed. I came across a an argument for the whole structure of Revelation by an Old Testament scholar, Meredith Kline, who had done his THM at Westminster Seminary. and this was his THM thesis, and it was really very good, and it really coincided with Hendrickson's view. So, in terms of the structure of Revelation, that's kind of what got me started understanding Revelation much better. In terms of have I changed over the years? I mean, there might be minor areas where there are Old Testament allusions that I haven't recognized,
Okay.
and they change the meaning of a verse, or there are maybe I had posed some Old Testament allusions, and now I've changed my mind on it. But in terms of the overall structure, the overall argument, no, my view on amillennialism in terms of the millennial perspective, that's the view that I take. I don't like to call it amillennialism because that literally means no millennium, and I believe in a literal millennium. I just
Yeah.
believe that it's not, I believe it begins spiritually at the resurrection and ends toward the end of the church age. And so I like to refer to my view as inaugurated
Okay.
millennialism. So,
Is, could you speak to maybe the personal impact that studying Revelation has had on your own life? Are
uh,
there ways that you've been impacted by this book that you didn't foresee when you started out with that doctoral dissertation?
yeah. It's just something that's impacted my wife too, because she's taught the Book of Revelation a couple of times for church groups, even recently. And so, what's really influenced us, uh, and this really has uh, uh, sparked us to recognize this in the rest of the New Testament much more, and that is the concept of priesthood.
Okay.
In chapter 1 and verse 6, um, John says he made them a kingdom and priests, or a kingdom of priests. And there's difficulty knowing which is it, a kingdom that is exercised through priesthood, or a priesthood that's exercised through reigning. Maybe a little bit of both. Um, but that's repeated in chapter 5 and verse 10. He made them a kingdom priest. And actually, chapter 20 and verse 6, it's repeated. That's what's going to happen in the millennium. It says, and they will be priests, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. And so I started thinking about this concept of priesthood. And uh, I think that this really goes into the area of the promise to the overcomers at the end of each of the letters, to him who overcomes, or to him who conquers. There are various ways they conquer. Maybe they conquer the sin of idolatry, or the sin of spiritual laziness, the sin of not witnessing. Some, of course, have no accusations, like Philadelphia and Smyrna. So they're just encouraged to persevere through the persecution that they're experiencing. And so, but that idea of overcoming, it's really an ironic idea. Christ says at the end, the last letter, to him who overcomes, um, uh, he also will overcome and will sit with me on my throne, as I have overcome. Well, how did Christ overcome? Well, he overcame not just through resurrection, but through death.
Hmm.
And I think that was chapter 1 and verse 5, right before the priesthood verse. And verse 6 says that, um, in fact, it's really the first part of verse 6, where it says that Christ, um, uh, what is it? He redeemed us by his blood, something like that. I don't have the text before me, but he redeemed us by his blood. And then all of a sudden it goes into this priesthood statement. And so the idea is that he was a priest in ransoming people. And so it's not unusual that then the next phrases will be about priesthood, because we're in union with Christ, so that we become priests. And the idea is that the way the kingdom in the inner Advent age is exercised is through ironic priesthood, through giving our life as a sacrifice in witnessing if persecution comes. That goes all the way down to everyday life. Hebrews chapter 13 says that sharing with one another and giving is a sacrifice to God. The same context, he says, give a sacrifice of praise to God. So whenever we are in a situation where someone can be benefited, maybe it's in a family relationship, a marriage, whatever, a church, if we're in a situation where we can give of ourselves for someone else's good, their betterment, especially in relationship to their relation with the Lord, then we give up what's best for us. We become priests and do what's best for them. Elizabeth Elliot said this, that we all die little deaths. So that this idea is not just about persecution and, being killed because of your faith, that this goes all the way down to serving one another.
Yeah.
And as a priest. So that involves all of your life. To be a priest is amazing. I'll sometimes pray that I'll be a priest to my wife, to basically sacrifice for her and to be forgiving to her. And that's one way that I feel that I can be faithful to my covenant with her. And so it's a very practical doctrine, in other words, and it permeates the whole book of Revelation, explains the Aaronic kingdom. It helps you understand Christ's Aaronic kingdom that he was introducing. He didn't come as a king and defeat the Romans. He came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. And that's a Son of Man statement. So his favorite statement about the Son of Man, which goes back to Daniel 7:13-14, is it looks like that's a very amazing kingship rule prophecy. But we see how it begins. It begins with the incognito Son of Man. Doesn't look like it. In fact, Son of Man in the Old Testament, even and in Judaism, just meant a poor suffering Slav.
Okay.
But when Jesus uses it, it has this dual intention for those who have ears to hear. No, this is not just some Son of Man sitting, at the gate begging or something like that. This is the Son of Man from Daniel 7. But those without ears to hear, Jesus is just some poor suffering beggar in person. So when we come into union with him, we do, what he did, as John actually says in chapter 1 and verse 9. He says, I, John, your partaker and your fellow brother and partaker in the tribulation and kingdom and perseverance that's in Jesus.
Yeah.
What does that mean? It's in Jesus. Well, I think he's talking about union with Jesus there. And I think he's talking partly about historically, what did Jesus do? He faced tribulation, he persevered through it. And as he was doing that, not after, but as he was doing that, he was reigning in a kingdom, ironically, as he ruled over the demonic spirits and sin, etc., climaxed at the cross when the devil thought he had defeated him, but he actually defeated the devil through the very death itself as he was ripping off Christ's kingdom at that time. And so we come into union with him, and we do what he did. First Peter talks about that since Christ suffered, we suffer, and it's explained in a priestly way in chapter 2 and verses 5 to 6, where he says, get the exact wording here in First Peter 2. It says that, and coming to him as to a living stone, rejected by men, but choice and precious in the sight of God, you also as living stones are being built up as a spiritual house, a temple for a holy priesthood to do what? To offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. long answer to your question.
Yeah, I appreciate
In
it.
union with Christ.
Yeah.
Now, I just finished a book about a year ago called Union with the Resurrected Christ,
Okay.
where I have a whole chapter on Christ as a king and a priest and believers as kings and priests.
I'm going to skip over this just as I want to make the most of our time and get to the questions I have. But out of that, I would love to follow that thread in your mind back into the Gospels and talk about like the priesthood being there in Christ's own teachings and in his ministry and stuff. Uh, but I'll hold on and stick to
Yeah.
the questions I have for you. Can I ask you what are the
I will
what
say there is a book by a former colleague of mine from Wheaton.
yeah,
His name is Nicholas Perrin,
sure.
Perrin,
I've heard of
and it's on Jesus as the temple in the Gospels. Very thick book.
oh yeah,
Nick
I'll write
Perrin,
that down.
Perrin,
Okay.
Jesus' Temple in the Gospels. Good book. He's a um, sort of he's a student of Tom Wright's. He used to be
Okay.
a teaching and research assistant for Tom Wright.
Okay. Well, I'll definitely check that out. I wonder if I could ask you, what have been some of the most common,
But by
even
the way,
perhaps, oh,
you can
sorry,
see why I said I'm not sure we're going to get through all these questions
for sure. Yeah.
because my answers, each question demands a substantive answer.
Yep. I whittled them down and I'll keep whittling.
All right.
I appreciate the longer answers. Please don't try and, be brief or anything. Uh, what have been some of the most common and perhaps even most frustrating misinterpretations or misconceptions that you have run into in the church or with students when it comes to the Book of Revelation?
When it comes to the book of
Yeah.
Revelation.
Are there any that kind of stick out that seem most common that you encounter?
Yes, I think all the various strange attempts to identify 666
Okay.
in chapter 13, it's
Hmm.
all very strange. And they try to take it literally as a barcode. You've probably heard that yourself.
Hmm.
And and then if they try to identify it with a man's name in some literal way. If it doesn't work in Greek, they'll use Hebrew. If it doesn't use Hebrew, they'll use Latin and so on, even English. And so that's uh, has not been very encouraging to see that happen over the years.
Yeah,
It's
that makes
clearly
sense.
spiritual. It's clearly spiritual because the next verse is chapter 14 and verse 1,
Hmm.
which says he sees a multitude, and that multitude on their foreheads is the name of God and Jesus Christ. And clearly that's not literal. It's clearly not literal. What it means is the name of God and Christ, they're identified with the character of Christ and his power and his presence. That's the point. That's what name means. And so the name of the beast, they're identified with the power and the presence and the character of the beast and the devil. So it's not to be taken in an overly literalistic way. And I guess this another thing that's and this is part of the debate in the church at a popular level, sometimes at an academic level, that people will take the Book of Revelation as literalistically as they can.
Hmm.
So there's 100-pound hail, for example, that's going to come according to Revelation, the end of Revelation 16 and so on. So, people are often not consistent when they try to be so literal. Like, for example, it's very clear, even to the most literal of interpreters, that chapter 17, 1 and 2, about the whore Babylon riding on a scarlet beast in verse 4, I believe. Um, uh, they have to take that symbolically. I mean, that's clearly not literal, um, but they do take Babylon as literal. They believe that that's referring to a prophecy from the Old Testament that Babylon will be on the earth again, literal Babylon in the Middle East, and be a world power. So that's a good example where they take it partly symbolically, but partly literally.
Speaking of the Old Testament, how important is the Old Testament for understanding Revelation symbols and themes? And maybe if, to follow up, how much does that affect our approach to reading Revelation?
Well, again, you have to understand there are different approaches to reading Revelation. I mean,
Okay.
some see the book from chapter 4 to 22:6 as exclusively future. Those who take that approach on the popular level are very literalistic. Some of the more academic people at Dallas Seminary, one who's written a recent commentary through the Zondervan Exegetical Commentary series, uh, um, takes it as completely future, but he's willing to see a more figurative approach, interestingly. So, you know, this book is very difficult to interpret. And so um, you're asking me what is my main approach to interpreting it? Tell me your question again. What was it
Yeah,
again?
even just your own approach and opinion. How important to you is the Old
Is the Old
Testament?
Testament?
Yeah,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
understanding.
Well, to me, I think it's very crucial.
Okay.
There are probably some even count 400 allusions to the Old Testament in the book of Revelation. One person recently has said 30. I won't say who that is, but that is, um, to say the least, uh, an underestimation.
Sure.
But
Yeah.
um, there are many, many allusions. Sometimes in one verse, there are three allusions.
Okay.
And a lot of the times, these allusions come from pictures in the Old Testament. So they form the pictures in Revelation. So you've got to go to the Old Testament to see what they mean. So obviously, the Old Testament is absolutely crucial for understanding the New. So in fact, I give the illustration that the book is very hard, but there are certain interpretive approaches that can really help. And I call the old and the new and the illusions, I see them as little sandbars because you almost drown in the apocalyptic book of Revelation. Okay, it's like a sea, it's very difficult. But you can get your head above the water, get the lay of the land where the islands are, uh, if you really consistently try to see the Old Testament allusions in every verse. That's going to get you up a little bit. It's not going to solve everything, but often it'll really help. So I think that's very crucial. For example, the church is called lampstand. Well, that comes out of Zechariah 4, which is dependent on, I believe, Exodus 28, where it describes the lampstand and the tabernacle. And so what's the point of this lampstand? Well, number one, when it says the churches are lampstands, what it means is they're a part of the temple. And they're part of the temple that Zechariah 4 was prophesying would be built. And they're part of the end time temple. Now, it looks like the temple that Zechariah 4 was prophesying, which is the second temple that was in the midst of being built, that's the main temple in view, but it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't even as great as the first temple. And so, really, what happens is that second temple becomes a typological foreshadowing of the end time temple, and that's what the church is part. They're the beginning part of the temple. In fact, you probably remember the phrase, um, do not despise the day of small things. Well, that is from Zechariah 4, where the beginning, small beginning of the building of the temple, uh, uh, in the midst of those who are threatening and oppressing, you could think, oh, this is nothing. But really, it was the beginning of something, which ends up foreshadowing Christ as the true temple and believers in Christ as the true temple. And so, Revelation, the seven lampstands are the temple. Well, now that identifies them, but then you have to ask, why are they called lampstands? And well, the lampstand in the Old Testament, when it's described, it says it shed light on the showbread, and there were 12 pieces of bread, so it shines light on Israel. And so I think the idea is it probably represented the revelatory presence of God
Okay.
upon Israel. So now the church is the place where the revelatory presence of God is. What are they to do with that? They're to shine. They're to shine their light. And so chapter 11 speaks of two lampstands, which I think are the two remnant churches um, out of the 12, symbolically just the remnant church. And and it speaks of them as two witnesses and how they're to be priests before God, mediating the revelatory presence of God. So they stand before God, before the throne, there in chapter 11 and verse 4. So, uh, so you can see then from the Old Testament, the church is part of the beginning temple because
Mhm.
the lampstand was in the holy place. And secondly, why is it called? You see, it's not just enough to identify it as
Sure.
the temple from the Old Testament, as part of the temple. Why the lampstand? Why isn't it called uh, um, the table of the showbread? Or why isn't it called the curtain? Or we could go on and on.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, they're part of the holy place, and they're part of that beginning temple, and they're to shine their light. So, and they're to do that as priests. So,
So
so
would you,
that's pretty rich.
yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that being said, would you say something like understanding Revelation? And I think we usually do the opposite of this, but to understand it properly, we need to read backwards rather than forwards.
Both,
Both. Okay.
both. And by reading forwards, what I mean is that when you're in Revelation, the best way to one of the best ways. Here's the second sandbar to stand on.
Okay.
Okay, get the lay of the land, not be immersed in the apocalyptic sea, and that is let Revelation interpret itself.
Okay.
So a beautiful example are the two witnesses that are called the two lampstands. Now there are many people who take that as two individual prophets from whose mouth fire will come forth and they'll turn water into blood. So they take them as two supernatural prophets. But we've already seen in chapters 1 to 3, the lampstands are the church. They're not individuals. So they're the church. Now, that doesn't yet answer, is it the church of the future? Is it the church of the past? Is it the church of the church age? For myself, I think it's the church of the church age because
Yep.
that was the main idea of uh, uh, the seven lampstands, seven standing for the universal church throughout the habitable earth. So, so that let Revelation interpret itself. You'll see words and especially phrases that are repeated, and sometimes you'll get a definition of them early on, but later you'll get no definition, as in chapter 11. It doesn't say they are the churches, does it? It just says two lampstands. Well, you got to let Revelation interpret Revelation. So that's what I mean by reading forward, starting early in Revelation and letting the later parts of the book interpreting the earlier, and vice versa. Now, uh, but I think the key thing is to read backwards.
Okay.
Many people look at the book of Revelation and they try to relate it to something now or
Mhm.
about to come in the future. But the book of Revelation is so filled with the Old Testament, our first default action should be not trying to look at the present or future. It should go back, not forward, back to see what this book means. Now, once you've determined that, and then you've let Revelation interpret itself, and you've let also some parts of the New Testament interpret Revelation. For example, there's a lot of material from the Gospels used in Revelation as well. Very important. And so once you've done all that, then you ask, okay, how does this relate to the present or to
Yeah.
the future?
Well, asking that then, how does it relate to the present, the future? What would you say is the relevance today of Revelation's critique of Babylon, like of worldly systems and worldly influences in our own culture?
Well, I think that you first have to define what Babylon is.
Okay.
And once you work on that, I think one can say um, that Babylon is uh, the worldly, uh, political, economic, and cultural system.
Okay.
Um, because we know that Babylon in the Old Testament was a state. Um, and so it's that ungodly economic, cultural, social, partly political, religious system. Um, and together with that, therefore, it overlaps with the apostate church and apostate Israel, because she's not just Babylon, she's harlot, the harlot Babylon. Well, harlot is a word used of Israel being unfaithful in her covenant relationship with God in the Old Testament, and including some of the nations. Sometimes they're called harlot because indeed, uh, even those outside of Israel should have been in relationship to Yahweh. So they weren't, they worshiped idols. And so they were also called harlots. So, that then overlaps with nations in general and with, if you will, the religious community, the apostate church, of which was a significant factor in the book of Revelation. So once you see that, then what you want to be careful of is falling into the trap of Babylon's influence, because it does say at the end of chapter 18 that uh, uh, she persuaded people by her pharmakeia. Uh, that's a word that we get pharmacy from. In fact, in Greece, their word for drugstore is pharmakeia. So if you go down the street and you want a drugstore, there are a lot of pharmakeias to choose from. But basically, it means drug. And then it talks about how the nations have drunk of her wine. She has uh, shot, she shoots people with her alcohol and her drugs to persuade them to follow her. What happens when you get drunk or you get high on drugs? You can't make good judgments. And so you've probably seen the commercial where a guy is drunk, he's walking on a building, and he thinks he can conquer the world. He just walks right off the building and he dies. So she puts into people a lack of fear in the
Okay.
coming judgment. Furthermore, that alcohol and those drugs make people open to temptation and to actually committing sin. As we know, when people get drunk, they're more open to gambling sins or sexual sins and fighting sins and so forth. So that's what Babylon does. It blinds people that way, and so it's interesting that I have a friend. His name is David Wells. And he wrote a book called No Place for Truth. And in that book, he defines worldliness and his definition of it, because this is what's part and parcel of Babylon. His definition is of worldliness is what any particular culture does to make sin seem normal and righteousness seem strange. And that's what Babylon the Great does,
Okay.
if I had to summarize it.
Yeah.
And so, the state does that. Uh, some religious Protestant Catholic churches do that are apostate. Um, um, the uh, our society and culture does that. Now, I did say that politically that she represented something political. I think probably that should be really de-emphasized, because at the end
Okay.
of chapter 17, it says that um, those who follow the beast, which are states, that they eat the flesh of Jezebel. So what you have is really the political side turning against the ungodly, worldly side. So probably we should emphasize Babylon the Great as the ungodly, cultural, and religious and social aspects with overlapping with the apostate church.
Well, I appreciate that uh answer. You
That's a general response, but I think
yeah.
that basically it's not hard to see, and in this culture especially, how the world, what worldliness is what any particular culture does to make sin seem normal and righteousness seem strange, and to
Yeah.
make me feel awkward and strange. This is why a lot of people who go into doctoral programs, if they're coming from an evangelical background and if
Yeah.
they're studying at a secular school, well, there's a new world they're going into. That world does not believe in the reliability of the Bible.
Sure.
That world does not believe in Jesus Christ as God. And we can go on. And so, if you're in seminars, one of my students was in a seminar at Yale. And when he said at one point he believed in the inerrancy of the Bible, they laughed at him. Well, you can see the kind of pressure. You don't want to feel odd.
Hmm.
You don't want anyone to think you're a weirdo or odd in the world. But that's the world. And the pressure is to become conformed to that world, to be put in the mold of that world so you can get the respect of that world. And no one wants to seem abnormal. You want to be normal.
Sure.
And so sometimes you'll compromise
Hmm.
when you're in situations like that. I've known people who've gone in the doctoral programs, they haven't compromised. I know some who have.
Okay.
And it's very difficult. So that would
But
be a specific example.
yeah, that David Wells quote is brilliant. I mean, you have to find that and remember that. It's a good way of thinking about it, summarizing it. Uh, I wonder if you could say something about how important or not important, how central or not central is the millennium to a proper understanding and application of Revelation. I think in the church, we generally make it huge. Uh,
Yeah, in my opinion,
yeah.
I don't think it is central.
Okay.
For example, um, Tom Schreiner, who's recently written a commentary on Revelation, he holds to what he calls, what does he call it? Millennial new creational millennialism. And it comes close to premillennialism. I think that you could hold to a premillennial view and still see that the seals and the trumpets and the bowls are synchronously parallel
Okay.
and all contain an already and not yet aspect to them. Usually at the end, there's the final judgment, usually the last two, generally speaking, preparing forward to the final judgment. And the rest, I think, is sort of church age material. So that's a classic, what's called a recapitulation view of the book of Revelation. I think you could hold that view and still be a premillennialist. Now, I would say you're inconsistent, but I think you could do it. So, uh, um, yeah, that's my answer.
It-
Now, most people take, or many of the premillennialists are a little more literal, and they'll take the trumpets coming after the seals,
sure.
and then the bowls coming after the trumpets. They see that there's what's laid out in Revelation is the way history will be played out. Okay, but I see it recapitulating for a number of reasons. But by the way, if you're familiar with the Old Testament and you've read Isaiah, if you read Ezekiel, if you've read Jeremiah, if you've read Daniel, especially Daniel 7 through 12, if you've read Zechariah, they recapitulate
Okay.
again and again and again and again and again and again. In fact, I know an author's name is Douglas Stewart. He used to teach at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, well-known Old Testament commentary writer. He said he was writing a commentary on Ezekiel. And he said, I almost had to, I'm paraphrasing him here,
Yeah.
said, I almost had to start using a thesaurus to, to talk about, describe with different words, just the repeated emphasis on exile and return, exile and return, exile and return, exile and return. But so that's what you get. And so we shouldn't be surprised. John is a
Yeah.
prophet. So that's
Yeah.
what um, it's called a prophecy in chapter 1, verse 3. In chapter 22, he's called a prophet. So, and elsewhere. So he's an Old Testament prophet.
Yeah.
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 Hey, I
That's a
have an
good.
idea. What if we do a part two later?
Oh, I would love to. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
want to do that? And then
Sure.
whatever you have and ask, we can do it. I'm sorry it's taken
Yeah.
so long to do this, and I'm sorry I almost missed today. I
No,
feel
no problem at all. I'm just thankful
almost
to.
thinking that some power is keeping me from having an interview with you.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I appreciate you making the time, Dr. Beale. Should we
okay,
cut it
well,
off here then?
yeah, let's cut off.